The gas lamps flickered against the grimy windows of McCarthy's tavern, casting dancing shadows across faces that had long forgotten hope. Inside, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and the bitter stench of cheap whiskey. Men huddled over their drinks like vultures protecting carrion, their voices a low rumble of desperation and broken dreams. 12-year-old Clara James pressed herself against the wall near the back door, her thin frame barely visible in the dim light. Her dress, once blue, had faded to the color of old bruises. She clutched a small cloth bundle containing everything she owned in this world: a torn photograph of her mother, a wooden button, and a piece of stale bread she'd been saving for tomorrow's breakfast. Her stepfather Paddy O'Sullivan sat at the bar, his massive frame hunched over a half-empty bottle of bourbon. His Irish accent had grown thicker with each drink, his words slurring into an incomprehensible melody of self-pity and rage. Clara had learned to read the signs, the way his shoulders tensed when the bartender mentioned payment, the dangerous glint in his bloodshot eyes when he counted his remaining coins. "She's a good worker, she is," Paddy was saying to the man beside him, gesturing wildly with his glass. "Strong hands, quiet mouth. Knows her place, that one does." The stranger wore a worn brown hat pulled low over his eyes. His coat had seen better decades, patched at the elbows and frayed at the cuffs. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who had seen too much and felt too little. "How much you owe, O'Sullivan?" Paddy's laugh was bitter, hollow. "Enough to drown in, friend. Enough to drown in." He took another swig, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Lost me job at the docks 3 months back. Wife's been dead near a year now. Got nothing left to sell but—" He glanced toward Clara, and she felt her stomach turn to ice. The stranger followed his gaze. Clara tried to make herself smaller, but there was nowhere to hide. The man studied her with the same detached interest a farmer might show when examining livestock at market. His eyes were gray, empty of warmth or cruelty, just business. "The girl's not yours by blood," the stranger observed. "It wasn't a question. Might as well be. Her mother married me legal-like. Makes her my responsibility." Paddy's voice carried a defensive edge. "And my property to do with as I see fit." Clara's hands trembled as she remembered her mother's last words, whispered from her deathbed in their cramped tenement room. "Be strong, my little bird. Be stronger than I was." Her mother had been beautiful once, with golden hair that caught the sunlight streaming through their single window. But poverty and sickness had drained the color from her cheeks, leaving behind only love and worry in her fading blue eyes. The stranger reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather pouch. The coins inside clinked together with a sound that made Clara's heart race. "1 bottle of bourbon," he said quietly. "Good bourbon. And the debt to Mickey cleared." Paddy's eyes widened. He looked at the bottle on the bar, nearly empty now, then at Clara, then back at the stranger. That's generous, friend. More than generous." His voice dropped to a whisper. "What exactly you need her for?" "Work. Nothing more, nothing less." The stranger's tone was flat, final. "She'll have food, shelter, purpose. More than she's got here." Clara wanted to scream, to run, to fight, but she had learned long ago that fighting only made things worse. When her mother was dying, she had fought the doctor who wanted to take her to the charity ward. When Paddy first moved into their room, she had fought his attempts to throw away her mother's few possessions. Fighting had only brought bruises and hunger. The transaction took less than 5 minutes. Paddy signed something on a piece of paper with shaking hands, his signature barely legible. The stranger counted out coins onto the bar, then stood and walked toward Clara. She pressed herself harder against the wall, but there was nowhere to go. "Come," he said simply. Not cruel, not kind. Just a statement of fact. Clara looked back at Paddy one last time. He was already pouring bourbon into his glass, his attention completely focused on the amber liquid. He didn't look up when she passed his table. He didn't say goodbye. The stranger led her out through the back door into the narrow alley behind the tavern. A wagon waited there, pulled by a tired-looking horse whose ribs showed through its dull coat. The wagon bed was filled with sacks of grain and wooden crates that smelled of soap and machine oil. "Get in," the stranger said, gesturing to a space between two crates. Clara climbed up slowly, her legs shaking. The stranger took his place on the driver's seat and clicked his tongue at the horse. The wagon lurched forward with a creak of old wood and tired springs. They rolled through the narrow streets of the Bowery, past the saloons and gambling houses that never truly closed. Gas lamps cast pools of yellow light on the cobblestones, illuminating scenes that would have shocked the respectable citizens of uptown Manhattan. Women in painted faces and low-cut dresses called to men from doorways. Children not much older than Clara darted between carriages, picking pockets and snatching purses with practiced skill. The stranger navigated the maze of streets with the confidence of someone who knew every shortcut and back alley. They passed a group of men huddled around a fire burning in a metal drum, warming their hands against the October chill. A woman in a tattered shawl pushed a baby carriage filled with rags and bottles, searching through refuse for anything of value. Clara had grown up in this world, but tonight it looked different. Tonight she was seeing it as someone being taken away from everything familiar, even if that familiar world had been cruel and hungry. The sounds grew distant, the laughter from the taverns, the arguments echoing from tenement windows, the clip-clop of horse hooves on stone. As they moved farther from the heart of the Bowery, the buildings began to change. The cramped tenements gave way to slightly larger structures, many showing signs of recent repair. Laundry hung from lines stretched between windows, and somewhere in the distance, Clara could hear the sound of children playing. The stranger hadn't spoken since they left the tavern. Clara studied his profile in the dim light, trying to read something, anything, in his expression. But his face remained impassive, focused on the road ahead. She wondered if he had children of his own, if he understood what it meant to be traded for a bottle of whiskey. The wagon hit a pothole, jolting Clara from her thoughts. They were entering a different neighborhood now, one where the gas lamps were fewer and farther apart. The darkness seemed deeper here, but somehow less threatening than the chaotic brightness they had left behind. Finally, the stranger pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a narrow three-story building squeezed between a bakery and a shop that appeared to sell fabric and thread. Warm yellow light glowed in several windows, and Clara could see the shadows of people moving inside. "This is it," the stranger said, climbing down from the wagon. He came around to help Clara down, his hands firm but not rough. "Name's Jacob, by the way. Should have mentioned that earlier." Clara found her voice for the first time since leaving the tavern. "What happens to me now?" Jacob looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time, she saw something almost like kindness in his gray eyes. "Now you get a chance to find out who you really are, Clara James. Away from him, away from all that." He gestured back toward the direction they had come. "Won't be easy, but it'll be honest work. And honest work builds honest character." He knocked on the door 3 short raps, then 2 longer ones. Clara heard footsteps approaching from inside, and her heart began to race again. Everything in her life was about to change, and she had no idea whether it would be for better or worse. Part 2: New Shelter Among Poverty. The door opened to reveal a woman who seemed carved from determination itself. Miriam Shapiro stood barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled the doorway completely. Her dark hair was pulled back severely from a face that spoke of sleepless nights and hard-won victories. She wore a simple brown dress covered by a leather apron stained with ink and fabric dye. Her eyes, dark as winter coal, swept over Clara with the practiced assessment of someone who had seen too many broken children arrive at her door. "Another one, Jacob?" Her voice carried the faint trace of an accent, Polish, perhaps, or Russian. Clara couldn't be sure. "Paddy O'Sullivan finally made good on his threats," Jacob replied, removing his hat. "Sold her for a bottle of bourbon and his tab at McCarthy's." Miriam's expression didn't change, but Clara saw her hands tighten slightly on the doorframe. "Age? 12, near as I can tell. Skills? Can sew, clean, cook basic meals. Literate. Her mother saw to that before she passed." Clara stood between them, feeling like a piece of merchandise being appraised. But there was something different in how these two discussed her fate. Where Patty had spoken of her as a burden to be rid of, they talked as if her abilities mattered, as if she were worth more than the sum of her potential labor. Inside, Miriam said finally, stepping back to allow them entry. Wipe your feet. The interior of the building was a revelation. What had appeared narrow from the street opened into a surprisingly spacious room that served multiple purposes. Half a dozen sewing machines occupied one corner, their black iron bodies gleaming in the lamplight. Bolts of fabric lined the walls, wool, cotton, and linen in shades ranging from practical brown to rich burgundy. The air smelled of machine oil, soap, and something Clara hadn't encountered in months. Fresh bread. But it was the children that truly captured her attention. 5 of them, ranging in age from perhaps 16 down to a toddler barely walking. They had all stopped what they were doing to stare at the newcomer, their expressions curious but not unfriendly. The oldest, a boy with serious dark eyes and prematurely broad shoulders, looked up from where he was adjusting the tension on one of the sewing machines. His hands were stained with ink, and Clara noticed several sheets of paper covered with neat columns of numbers spread across the table beside him. Isaac, Miriam said. This is Clara. She'll be staying with us. Isaac nodded once, then returned to his work without comment. But Clara caught him glancing at her several times, as if trying to solve a puzzle. A girl perhaps a year or two younger than Isaac bounced up from where she had been reading to the smaller children. Her hair was the same dark brown as Miriam's, but it curled wildly around her face, refusing to be completely tamed by the ribbon that attempted to hold it back. I'm Rachel, she announced, approaching Clara with a smile that seemed to light up the entire room. Are you hungry? Mama always makes extra soup, just in case. She says you never know when someone might need feeding, and it's better to have too much than too little. Rachel, Miriam said quietly, but not unkindly. Let the girl breathe first. 2 boys who looked to be about 8 or 9 sat on the floor near the fireplace, building something elaborate with wooden blocks and scraps of cloth. They were clearly twins, though one was slightly taller than the other. They whispered to each other in what sounded like a mixture of English and another language Clara didn't recognize, occasionally erupting into muffled giggles. Moses and Levi, Rachel explained, following Clara's gaze. They're always building something. Last week they constructed an entire city under Isaac's bed. He wasn't pleased when he tried to go to sleep. The youngest child, a boy of perhaps 3, sat in a wooden high chair at the kitchen table. He watched Clara with enormous dark eyes, a piece of bread clutched in one chubby fist. When Clara smiled at him, he ducked his head shyly but peeked at her from under his lashes. And that's Benjamin, Rachel continued. He doesn't talk much yet, but he understands everything. Don't you, Benny? Benjamin responded by offering Clara a piece of his bread, holding it out with a solemn expression that suggested this was a great honor. Miriam moved through the room with efficient purpose, clearing a space at the large wooden table that dominated the center of the room. Sit, she told Clara. Jacob, thank you for bringing her safely. There's stew if you want some before you go. I should get back, Jacob replied, settling his hat back on his head. Mickey's expecting his grain delivery before midnight. He paused at the door and looked back at Clara. You'll do well here, girl. Mind what Mrs. Shapiro tells you. Work hard, and keep your ears open. You might learn something. After he left, the room felt smaller but somehow warmer. Miriam ladled soup into a chipped ceramic bowl and set it in front of Clara along with a thick slice of bread that was still warm from the oven. The soup was unlike anything Clara had tasted in the past year, rich with vegetables and chunks of actual meat, seasoned with herbs that made her mouth water. Eat, Miriam commanded, settling into the chair across from her. Then we'll talk about what comes next. Clara ate slowly, partly because the food was so good she wanted to savor every spoonful, and partly because she was afraid of what comes next might entail. Around her, the family resumed their evening activities. Isaac returned to his calculations, occasionally calling out numbers to Miriam, who would nod or suggest corrections. Rachel helped the twins clean up their blocks while humming a melody Clara didn't recognize. Benjamin gnawed contentedly on his bread, occasionally babbling something that might have been words. When Clara's bowl was empty, Miriam refilled it without being asked. "You're too thin," she observed matter-of-factly. "How long since you had a proper meal?" Clara had to think about it. "Before Mama got sick," she said finally. "Maybe 6 months?" Miriam's expression darkened briefly, but she said nothing. Instead, she stood and walked to a cabinet near the sewing machines. She returned with a small cloth bag that she set on the table between them. "These are buttons," she said, untying the bag to reveal dozens of buttons in various sizes and colors. "Tomorrow you'll sort these by size and color. After that, you'll help Rachel with mending. Can you do basic stitches?" "Yes, ma'am. Mama taught me." "Good. The day after tomorrow, we'll see how you handle the machine work." Miriam's eyes met Clara's directly. "I don't give charity, child. Everyone in this house works, everyone contributes, everyone earns their place. But everyone also eats, everyone has a bed, and everyone is protected. Do you understand?" Clara nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she did understand. The concept of earning her place was familiar. Patty had made it clear she was a burden to be tolerated only as long as she made herself useful. But the idea of protection, of being part of something larger than simple survival, was foreign and slightly frightening. "Where will I sleep?" she asked. "With Rachel for now," Miriam replied. "She'll show you where to wash up and find you something clean to wear. Tomorrow we'll see about getting you properly fitted." As if summoned by her name, Rachel appeared at Clara's elbow. "Come on," she said cheerfully. "I'll show you everything. We have a real wash basin upstairs. And Mama got some new soap last week that smells like lavender. Well, sort of like lavender. And maybe like turnips. But mostly lavender." Clara followed Rachel up a narrow staircase to the second floor, which was divided into 3 small bedrooms. Rachel's room was barely large enough for 2 narrow beds and a small dresser, but it was clean and warm, with cheerful yellow curtains at the single window. "That's yours," Rachel said, pointing to the bed nearer the wall. "I put fresh sheets on it this morning. Mama always keeps spare beds ready. She says you never know when someone might need a safe place to sleep." As Clara washed her face and hands in the basin Rachel provided, she tried to process everything that had happened. This morning she had woken up on a pile of rags in the corner of Patty's room, wondering if there would be anything to eat. Tonight she was going to sleep in a real bed with clean sheets, her stomach full of warm food, surrounded by people who seemed to consider her presence a gift rather than a burden. "Why does your mother take in children?" Clara asked as she settled under the surprisingly soft blankets. Rachel was quiet for a moment, braiding her unruly hair for the night. "Because someone took us in once," she said finally. "When we first came to America, we had nothing, less than nothing. A family in the old neighborhood gave us shelter until Mama could find work and save enough for this place. She says kindness is like bread. It only gets stale if you don't share it." Clara lay in the darkness after Rachel's breathing deepened into sleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what had happened to her. For the first time in months, she wasn't cold. Her stomach wasn't cramping with hunger. She wasn't listening for Patty's footsteps on the stairs, wondering if tonight would be the night his temper finally snapped completely. Instead, she was listening to the sounds of a house full of people who cared about each other. Isaac's quiet voice as he said goodnight to his mother, the twins whispering and giggling in their room across the hall, Miriam's footsteps as she moved through the house, checking locks and banking the fires for the night. Tomorrow she would sort buttons and learn to use a sewing machine. She would earn her place in this strange new world where work was valued and protection was freely given. She would discover who Clara James could become when she was no longer defined by what she had lost. Part 3. New conditions, difficult but honest. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of sewing machines already humming downstairs. For a moment, she lay in the unfamiliar bed, disoriented by the absence of the usual sounds that had marked her mornings for the past year. Patty's snoring, the crash of empty bottles being knocked to the floor, the angry shouts from neighboring tenements. Instead, she heard quiet voices, the whistle of a kettle, and the steady rhythm of productive work beginning. Rachel's bed was already empty, the covers pulled neat and tight. Clara dressed quickly in the clean clothes that had been laid out for her the night before. A simple brown dress that was slightly too large but infinitely cleaner than anything she had worn in months. The fabric was soft wool, well-mended but sturdy, and it smelled of the lavender soap Rachel had mentioned. Downstairs, the household was already in full motion. Miriam stood at one of the sewing machines, her hands moving with practiced precision as she guided fabric through the mechanism. The twins sat at the kitchen table, eating porridge and whispering to each other in their mysterious mixture of languages. Isaac was nowhere to be seen, but Clara could hear movement from what she assumed was a cellar or basement below. "Good you're awake," Miriam said without looking up from her work. "Rachel will show you where everything is. Breakfast first, then we begin." Rachel appeared from the kitchen area carrying a bowl of porridge topped with a generous dollop of honey. "Mama gets the honey from Mr. Kowalski downstairs," she explained, setting the bowl in front of Clara. "He keeps bees on the roof. Sometimes you can hear them buzzing when it's quiet." The porridge was warm and filling, but Clara ate quickly, anxious to begin whatever tasks awaited her. She had learned that in places like this, usefulness was survival, and the faster she proved her worth, the safer her position would be. When she finished eating, Miriam led her to a small table near the window where the bag of buttons waited. "Sort by size first," she instructed, "smallest to largest, then by color within each size group. Rachel will check your work when you're finished." Clara had expected this to be simple, mindless work, but she quickly discovered that button sorting required more attention than she had anticipated. The sizes varied by tiny increments that were difficult to distinguish, and many of the colors were subtle variations that shifted depending on the light. She found herself holding buttons up to the window, comparing them carefully before making decisions about placement. As she worked, she became aware of the complex choreography taking place around her. Miriam moved between 3 different sewing machines, each apparently set up for different types of work. One handled heavy canvas and leather, creating what looked like work gloves and protective aprons. Another managed delicate fabrics, producing items that Clara couldn't immediately identify but which involved intricate stitching and small, precise seams. Rachel moved through the room like a dancer, carrying supplies from one station to another, threading needles, changing spools of thread, and occasionally taking over at one of the machines when Miriam needed to check on the younger children. Despite her cheerful chatter the night before, Rachel worked with focused concentration, her hands steady and sure as she handled delicate fabrics. The twins had finished their breakfast and were now seated on cushions near the fireplace, each with a basket of what appeared to be damaged clothing. Clara watched as they carefully examined each piece, sorting items into different piles. Moses held up a shirt with a torn sleeve, showing it to Levi, who nodded and pointed to a specific pile. Their system was clearly well established, though Clara couldn't yet decipher the logic behind their sorting. Isaac emerged from the basement carrying a heavy crate, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hair slightly disheveled. He nodded to Clara as he passed her table, then began unpacking bolts of fabric from the crate. Each bolt was examined carefully, measured, and logged in a ledger book that he kept meticulously updated. "Isaac handles all our purchasing and inventory," Rachel explained during a brief break in her duties. "He's got a head for numbers that makes Mama proud. And he knows which suppliers to trust and which ones try to pass off inferior goods." Clara noticed that Isaac rarely spoke directly to her, but she didn't sense hostility in his silence. Rather, he seemed to be reserving judgment, watching how she handled herself before deciding whether to trust her. She had encountered this caution before in children who had learned to be wary of strangers, and she respected it. By midday, Clara had completed her button sorting and moved on to her next task, examining a pile of men's work shirts that needed mending. Some had simple tiers that required basic stitching, while others needed more complex repairs. Patches, reinforcement of stress points, or complete replacement of worn collars and cuffs. "Start with the easy ones," Rachel advised, settling beside her with her own pile of mending. "Basic tiers, loose buttons, that sort of thing. Save the complicated repairs for later, when you've gotten the feel of our thread and needles." Clara selected a shirt with a small tear in the sleeve and began working. Her mother had taught her to sew when she was 7, and the familiar motions of needle and thread felt like a connection to happier times. As she worked, her hands remembered skills she hadn't used in months, and she found herself relaxing for the first time since arriving. "Where do all these clothes come from?" she asked as she finished repairing the tear. "Different places," Rachel replied. "Some from the garment factories downtown. They send us work that their regular seamstresses don't have time for. Some from families in the neighborhood who need repairs but can't afford the fancy tailors uptown. And some." She glanced toward Isaac, who was deep in conversation with Miriam about something in his ledger book. "Some from places that don't ask too many questions about where we learned to do this kind of work." Clara sensed there was more to this story than Rachel was sharing, but she didn't press. Every family had secrets, especially families that had come to America with nothing and built something from scratch. As the afternoon wore on, Clara began to understand the rhythm of the household. Work was constant but not frantic. Each person had specific responsibilities, but they helped each other when needed. Miriam was clearly in charge, but she didn't rule through fear or intimidation. Instead, she led by example, working harder than anyone else and making decisions that benefited the entire group. The quality of work was also different from what Clara had expected. Every repair was done with care, every seam was straight and strong, every button was sewn on to last. This wasn't the desperate, slapdash work of people trying to survive from day to day. This was the patient, skilled work of people building something permanent. During a brief break for lunch, thick slices of bread with butter and jam, along with milk that was actually fresh, Clara found herself sitting next to Isaac at the kitchen table. The twins were napping, Benjamin was playing quietly with wooden blocks, and Rachel was helping Miriam with something that required intense concentration. "You're not what I expected," Isaac said quietly, speaking directly to her for the first time. "What did you expect?" Clara asked. "Someone more." He paused, searching for the right word. "Damaged. Broken. Most of the children who come here have been hurt badly. Takes them time to trust. Time to understand that work here is different from work other places." Clara considered this. "Maybe I was damaged. Maybe I still am. But your mother didn't buy me to be grateful or quiet. She bought me to work, and I know how to work." Isaac nodded slowly. "That's why you might actually fit here. The ones who try too hard to please, who say they're grateful for everything, they usually don't last. They're still thinking like victims instead of thinking like family." This was the longest conversation Clara had had with anyone since arriving, and she found herself surprised by Isaac's perception. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably only 14 or 15, but he spoke with the wisdom of someone who had seen enough to understand the difference between charity and opportunity. "Is that what this is?" she asked. "Family? It's what Mama calls it. What it becomes if you stay long enough and work hard enough." Isaac finished his bread and stood up. "The work is hard here, but it's honest. Nobody takes more than they earn, nobody gets hurt for making mistakes, and nobody gets thrown away when they're no longer useful. That's more than most places offer." As Clara returned to her mending that afternoon, she reflected on Isaac's words. The work was indeed hard. Her fingers were already sore from needle pricks, and her back ached from hunching over tiny stitches. But there was something deeply satisfying about watching a torn shirt become whole again, about knowing that her work would help someone stay warm and presentable. More importantly, for the first time in her life, Clara felt like her work mattered not just for survival, but for something larger. She was contributing to an enterprise that supported not just herself, but an entire family. Her skill with a needle was valued not just for what it could earn, but for what it could build. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table for a meal of vegetable soup and fresh bread, Clara realized that she had spoken more words that day than in any single day since her mother's death. She had asked questions, offered suggestions, even laughed at one of the twins' elaborate stories about their imaginary city. When Miriam asked her how her first day had gone, Clara answered honestly, "Hard work, but good work. I want to learn to use the machines tomorrow." Miriam smiled, the first genuine smile Clara had seen from her. "Then we'll see what you're really made of, Clara James." Machine work separates the workers from the artists. As Clara climbed the stairs to bed that night, her hands sore but her stomach full, she realized that something fundamental had shifted in how she thought about herself. She was no longer just surviving from one day to the next. She was building something, becoming someone, earning her place in a world where hard work was respected and skill was valued. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. And honest work, she was beginning to understand, had the power to rebuild not just torn fabric but damaged souls. Part 4. Sudden Absence and Silence. 3 weeks had passed since Clara's arrival, and she had settled into the rhythm of the Shapiro household like a thread finding its place in a complex weaving. She had mastered the button sorting, proven herself skilled at mending, and was beginning to learn the intricacies of machine work under Isaac's patient instruction. Her hands, once soft from idleness and malnutrition, had developed the small calluses that marked a working seamstress. The morning started like any other. Clara woke to the familiar sounds of the household stirring to life, the whistle of the kettle, the gentle hum of early conversation, the rhythmic sound of Miriam's footsteps as she moved between the kitchen and the workshop area. But when Clara came downstairs, dressed and ready for the day's work, she found only Isaac standing at the stove, stirring a pot of porridge with unusual concentration. "Where's your mother?" Clara asked, looking around the room. The sewing machines sat silent and still, an oddity that immediately set her nerves on edge. Isaac didn't look up from the porridge. "Gone," he said simply. "Gone where?" "Don't know." His voice was carefully controlled, but Clara could hear the underlying tension. "Was gone when I got up this morning. Left this." He handed her a folded piece of paper. Clara opened it to find a brief message written in Miriam's precise handwriting. "Take care of each other. Keep working. I will return when I can. Trust Isaac." Clara stared at the note, reading it twice before the words fully registered. She just left? Without explanation. "Mama doesn't do things without reasons," Rachel said from the doorway, her voice smaller than usual. She was holding Benjamin, who seemed to sense the unusual tension in the house and clung to her more tightly than normal. Something important must have happened. The twins appeared at the top of the stairs, still in their nightclothes, their usual morning energy subdued by the strange atmosphere. Moses whispered something to Levi, who shook his head and whispered back. Their secret language, which had always seemed playful before, now felt like a barrier protecting them from a world that had suddenly become uncertain again. Clara felt a familiar cold dread settling in her stomach, the same feeling she had experienced when her mother first fell ill, when the coughing started and wouldn't stop, when the fever began and wouldn't break. It was the feeling of stability crumbling, of safety proving to be an illusion, of the people who mattered most disappearing without warning. "What do we do?" she asked Isaac, hating how young and frightened her voice sounded. Isaac ladled porridge into bowls with mechanical precision. "We do what the note says. We take care of each other, and we keep working." He met her eyes for the first time since she had come downstairs. "The fabric orders don't stop coming just because Mama's not here. The rent doesn't stop being due. The younger ones don't stop needing food and clothing and someone to tell them everything will be all right." Clara nodded, but her mind was racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. What if Miriam had been arrested? What if she had been hurt? What if she had simply decided that taking care of 5 children plus Clara was too much responsibility, too much cost, too much trouble? The day passed in a strange, muted version of their usual routine. Isaac took over directing the work, assigning tasks and checking quality with the same careful attention to detail that Miriam had always shown. Rachel managed the younger children, keeping them fed and occupied while also contributing her share of the sewing work. The twins seemed to understand instinctively that this was not a day for elaborate games or loud laughter, and they worked on their sorting and simple mending tasks with unusual focus. Clara threw herself into machine work with desperate intensity, as if perfect seams and precise stitching could somehow hold the world together. But underneath her concentration ran a constant stream of worry. Every footstep on the stairs outside made her heart race with hope. Every sound from the street below sent her rushing to the window, looking for a familiar figure in a brown dress and leather apron. By evening, when Miriam still hadn't returned, the household felt hollow despite being full of people. They ate dinner in near silence, the usual chatter and storytelling replaced by worried glances and half-finished sentences. Benjamin, too young to understand what was happening but old enough to sense the tension, refused to eat and cried inconsolably until Rachel sang him to sleep with a lullaby in the language that Clara was slowly recognizing as Yiddish. Maybe she went to help someone, Rachel suggested as she and Clara cleaned up after dinner. Mama knows lots of people in the neighborhood. Sometimes they need help that can't wait. For a whole day? Without telling anyone. Clara couldn't keep the skepticism out of her voice. Mama's helped people in trouble before. Sometimes the kind of trouble where you can't leave notes or explanations. Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. Isaac knows more about it than he tells us younger ones. But there are people who need to disappear sometimes. People who need new papers, new names, new lives. Mama's helped with that. Clara absorbed this information, trying to fit it into her understanding of the woman who had taken her in. It made sense in a way, Miriam's careful way of asking questions, her network of contacts like Jacob, her ability to appear completely respectable while clearly operating outside the usual channels of middle-class society. But if she's helping someone else, what happens to us? Rachel was quiet for a long moment, carefully drying each dish before stacking it in the cupboard. I don't know, she admitted finally. I've never been without Mama before. None of us have, except Isaac, and he was so little when Papa died that he barely remembers. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Without Miriam's presence, every creak seemed ominous, every distant sound from the street below a potential threat. She found herself cataloging escape routes, counting the coins she had earned and wondering if it would be enough for a train ticket somewhere far from New York. But as the hours passed, another feeling began to emerge alongside her fear. It was a fierce protectiveness, particularly toward the younger children who had welcomed her so readily into their strange, improvised family. Benjamin with his serious dark eyes and generous spirit. The twins with their elaborate games and unshakable bond. Even Rachel, despite being older, seemed younger than Clara in some essential way, less scarred by loss, more trusting in the fundamental goodness of the world. They had become precious to her in a way that surprised her with its intensity. The thought of them being separated, sent to different institutions or foster families, filled her with a rage that burned hotter than her fear. When morning came, Clara rose before the others and went downstairs to start breakfast. She lit the stove, put water on to boil, and began mixing batter for the kind of thick, filling pancakes that would keep everyone's energy up for a long day of work. As she worked, she made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She would not run. She would not abandon these children the way she herself had been abandoned. Whatever was required to keep the household functioning until Miriam returned. And she had to believe that Miriam would return, Clara would do it. Isaac appeared in the kitchen doorway just as Clara was flipping the first batch of pancakes. He watched her work for a moment, then began setting the table without being asked. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For staying. For not disappearing in the night like—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Clara understood. Other children had come and gone from this house. She was not the first person to be offered a place in this improvised family, and probably not the first to face the test of whether she would stay when things became difficult. "Where would I go?" she asked, trying to make her voice light. Isaac smiled for the first time since his mother had disappeared. "Exactly." As the rest of the family gathered around the breakfast table, Clara looked at each face and made a silent promise. Whatever came next, whether Miriam returned today or tomorrow or next week, these children would not go hungry. They would not be separated. They would not be abandoned. She had been sold like trash once before, treated as something disposable and worthless. But she had learned something in the weeks since coming to this house. Worth was not something that was given to you by other people. It was something you created through your choices, your work, your willingness to stand firm when everything around you threatened to collapse. Today, she would choose to be worth something. Today, she would choose to stay. The sewing machines hummed to life as they always did, the familiar rhythm providing comfort in an uncertain world. Outside, Brooklyn continued its daily business, unaware that 6 children were quietly proving to themselves and each other that family was not just about blood or legal papers, but about the decision to care for each other when caring was the hardest thing to do. Clara bent over her work, her hands steady on the fabric, her heart full of a fierce determination that surprised her with its strength. Whatever had taken Miriam away from them, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They would take care of each other, just as the note had instructed. And they would keep working because work was what transformed children into family, strangers into protectors, fear into strength. The thread that held them together was made of more than cotton or silk. It was woven from shared purpose, mutual dependence, and the radical decision to believe that they were all worth saving. Part 5: Traces of the Past. 5 days had passed since Miriam's disappearance, and Clara had fallen into the role of temporary household manager with a determination that surprised even herself. She woke before dawn each morning to start breakfast, organized the day's work assignments, and made sure the younger children were fed, clean, and occupied. Isaac handled the business side of their operations, dealing with suppliers, managing orders, and keeping the meticulous records that Miriam had taught him to maintain. It was on the 6th morning, as Clara was hanging laundry on the lines stretched between their building and the one next door, that she saw the figure watching from across the street. A man in a police uniform, standing in the shadow of a doorway, making no effort to hide his presence but also making no move to approach. When Clara looked directly at him, he didn't look away. Instead, he touched the brim of his cap in a gesture that might have been polite acknowledgement or subtle threat. She finished hanging the wash with hands that trembled only slightly, then went inside and climbed the stairs to where Isaac was working at the kitchen table, updating their inventory ledgers. "There's a policeman outside," she said quietly, mindful of the younger children playing nearby. "He's been watching the building." Isaac's pencil stilled against the paper. "How long?" "I don't know. I just noticed him when I went to hang the washing." Clara kept her voice level, but she could feel panic starting to build in her chest. "Do you think he's looking for your mother?" "Maybe." Isaac closed the ledger and moved to the window, positioning himself so he could see the street without being clearly visible from below. "Or maybe he's looking for someone else who's supposed to be here." Clara felt ice form in her stomach. "Me. It's possible. Patty might have decided he made a bad bargain. Or," Isaac's expression darkened, "or someone might have told him he could get more money by claiming you were stolen instead of sold." The implications hit Clara like a physical blow. If Patty had reported her as kidnapped rather than sold, then everyone who had helped her, Jacob, Miriam, the entire household, could be charged with serious crimes. The children could be taken away, the business destroyed, lives ruined. "What do we do?" Clara asked. Before Isaac could answer, there was a sharp knock at the door. Not the polite rap of a neighbor or the coded knock of a regular customer, but the authoritative pound of someone with official business and no patience for delays. Isaac motioned for Clara to move away from the window. "Rachel," he called softly, "take the little ones upstairs. Now." Rachel appeared from the workroom, took one look at Isaac's face, and immediately began gathering Benjamin and the twins. "Come on," she said in a voice that was calm but brooked no argument. "Let's go play the quiet game upstairs." The knocking came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a voice that carried through the thin door. "Police, open up. We need to ask some questions." Isaac straightened his shoulders and walked to the door, but didn't open it immediately. "What kind of questions, officer?" "The kind best discussed face to face." "Open the door, son." Clara positioned herself behind Isaac, close enough to hear but far enough back that she wouldn't be immediately visible when the door opened. Her heart was beating so hard she was certain it could be heard throughout the building. Isaac opened the door to reveal not just the policeman Clara had seen from the window, but 2 others behind him. The lead officer was older, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had walked these streets for decades. His uniform was neat but not new, and his expression was professionally neutral, neither threatening nor reassuring. "I'm Officer Brennan," he said, removing his cap. We're looking for a girl named Clara James. Irish girl, about 12 years old, red hair. We understand she might be staying here. Who's asking? Isaac replied, not moving aside to allow them entry. Her legal guardian filed a missing person report. Says she was taken from his home without permission. Brennan's eyes moved past Isaac, scanning what he could see of the interior. We're just trying to make sure she's safe and get her back where she belongs. Clara felt her knees wobble. The word belongs hit her like a slap. She belonged to Patty in the eyes of the law, the same way a piece of furniture or a farm animal belonged to its owner. Her preferences, her safety, her desperate need to escape, none of that mattered compared to the legal papers that gave Patty the right to control her fate. There's no girl by that name here, Isaac said firmly. Just my family. Officer Brennan stepped closer to the doorway. Son, interfering with a police investigation is a serious matter. If you're hiding someone who doesn't belong here, you're putting yourself and your family in danger. And if you're trying to force a child back into a situation where she's not safe, you're the one putting people in danger. Isaac replied, not backing down despite being dwarfed by the 3 adult men. Clara made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. She stepped forward, moving into view behind Isaac's shoulder. I'm Clara James, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. And I'm not going back. Officer Brennan's expression softened slightly when he saw her. Miss, we understand you might be confused or scared, but your stepfather is worried about you. He says you ran away after an argument, and he's been looking for you for weeks. He didn't look very hard, Clara replied. He sold me to pay his bar tab. Ask anyone at McCarthy's Tavern if you don't believe me. Now, miss, that's a serious accusation. Mr. O'Sullivan says. Mr. O'Sullivan is a drunk and a liar, Clara interrupted, anger giving her courage. He traded me to Jacob Mueller for a bottle of bourbon and his gambling debts. There were witnesses. The officers exchanged glances. Brennan pulled out a small notebook and pencil. Jacob Mueller, you said? That's right. Ask him. Ask Mickey at the bar. Ask any of the men who were there that night. Clara stepped fully into the doorway, placing herself between the police and the household behind her. I'm not going back to someone who thinks I'm worth less than a bottle of whiskey. Miss James, Brennan said gently, even if what you say is true, the law says you belong with your legal guardian until you're of age. We can't just ignore that because you don't like the arrangement. The law also says children shouldn't be sold like livestock, Clara shot back. But that doesn't seem to matter when it's inconvenient for adults. Behind her, she heard Isaac moving quietly through the room. She hoped he was hiding anything that might implicate Miriam or the others in helping her. If the police decided to search the house, evidence of her integration into the household routine could be used against everyone who had helped her. Where's the woman who runs this place? The second officer asked, speaking for the first time. We heard there's a widow woman keeps a sewing business here. Mrs. Shapiro is away on business, Isaac replied smoothly. I'm managing things until she returns. When will that be? Soon, Isaac said, in a tone that discouraged further questions. Officer Brennan closed his notebook and looked directly at Clara. Miss, I'm going to give you a choice. You can come with us now, voluntarily, and we'll make sure you get back to your guardian safely. Or we can come back with a warrant and take you by force, which won't be pleasant for anyone involved. Clara felt the walls of her new life closing in around her. Everything she had built here, her place in the family, her growing skills, her sense of worth and purpose, was about to be destroyed by a legal system that saw her as property rather than a person. But then she heard something that changed everything. The sound of multiple sets of footsteps on the stairs behind her. Rachel appeared at her shoulder, followed by the twins, and even little Benjamin toddling along determinedly. They arranged themselves around Clara, not saying a word but making their position absolutely clear. She's not going anywhere, Rachel said quietly. This is her home now. Moses whispered something to Levi, who nodded and stepped closer to Clara. Benjamin, not fully understanding what was happening but sensing the tension, reached up and took Clara's hand in his small one. Officer Brennan looked at the group of children, his expression troubled. This is a family matter, children. It's not your concern. It is our concern, Isaac said firmly. Clara's part of our family now, and we take care of our family. The standoff stretched out for long moments, 6 children facing 3 adult men with the weight of law behind them. Clara realized that this moment would define not just her own future, but the future of everyone who had chosen to stand with her. Then, from behind the police officers, came a voice that made Clara's heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. What seems to be the problem here, officers? Clara turned to see a woman approaching from the street. Not Miriam, but someone else entirely. An African-American woman in a neat gray dress, carrying a basket and walking with the confident stride of someone who belonged in this neighborhood. She was perhaps 40 years old, with intelligent eyes and an expression of polite curiosity that didn't quite hide a sharp assessment of the situation. "Police business, ma'am," Officer Brennan replied. "Nothing that concerns you." The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, but it does concern me. You see, I'm Harriet Brown, and I've been looking after these children while Mrs. Shapiro is away. Is there some trouble I should know about?" Part 6. The stranger's arrival. Officer Brennan turned to face Harriet Brown, his expression shifting from professional authority to subtle uncertainty. Clara could see him reassessing the situation. A well-dressed African-American woman claiming responsibility for a household of white children was not something that had been covered in his training manual. "Ma'am," Brennan said carefully, "we're here about a missing child. Clara James here was reported as taken from her legal guardian's home without permission." Harriet set down her basket and looked at Clara with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Is that so? And who might this legal guardian be?" "Patrick O'Sullivan, her stepfather," the second officer supplied. "He's been looking for her for weeks." Harriet's expression darkened almost imperceptibly. "Patrick O'Sullivan," she repeated slowly, as if tasting something unpleasant. "Irish fellow? Drinks at McCarthy's place down in the Bowery. You know him?" Brennan asked, his interest sharpening. "I know of him," Harriet replied carefully. "Word travels in certain circles about men who, well, let's say men who don't always treat their responsibilities with proper care." She looked directly at Clara. "Child, are you here by your own choice?" Clara felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Everything depended on her answer, but also on how she gave it. Too eager, and the police might think she had been coached. Too reluctant, and they might think she was being coerced. "Yes, ma'am," she said simply. "I choose to stay here." "And why is that, if you don't mind my asking?" Clara took a deep breath. "Because here I'm treated like a person with value, not like something to be traded away when it's convenient." Harriet nodded slowly, then turned back to the officers. "Gentlemen, I wonder if I might have a word with you privately? There are some things about Mr. O'Sullivan's business practices that might be relevant to your investigation." Officer Brennan looked uncertain. "Ma'am, we appreciate your concern, but we have our orders. The girl needs to come with us." "Of course," Harriet said smoothly. "I wouldn't dream of interfering with police business. But surely you want to make sure you have all the facts before taking action. After all, if there are irregularities in how the child came to be here, that might affect the legal situation considerably." The third officer, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "What kind of irregularities?" Harriet glanced at the children clustered around Clara, then back at the officers. "The kind that might be better discussed away from young ears. Perhaps we could step down to the street for a moment." Clara watched as the 3 policemen conferred in low voices. She could see the calculation in their faces, the desire to complete their assignment quickly versus the recognition that complications might arise if they acted without full information. Finally, Brennan nodded. 5 minutes, ma'am. But then we need to resolve this situation one way or another." As the adults moved toward the stairs, Harriet caught Clara's eye and gave her an almost imperceptible nod. Clara wasn't sure what it meant, but something in the woman's manner suggested that help had arrived from an unexpected quarter. Isaac closed the door behind them and immediately began moving through the room, checking windows and gathering important papers. "I don't know who she is," he said quietly. "But she's buying us time. We need to use it." "Use it for what?" Rachel asked, her voice tight with worry. "To figure out what our options are," Isaac replied. "Clara, do you have any proof of what Patty did? Any witnesses who might speak for you?" Clara thought desperately. Jacob was there. He's the one who arranged everything. And Mickey, the bartender, he saw the whole thing. But I don't know if they'd be willing to testify against Patty. "They might be willing to testify for you," Isaac said, "especially if they understand what's at stake." From the window, Clara could see the group on the street below. Harriet Brown was speaking earnestly to the officers, her hands moving expressively as she made some point. The policemen were listening, but their body language suggested skepticism mixed with growing concern. "What do you think she's telling them?" Rachel whispered. "The truth, I hope," Clara replied. "Or at least a version of it that makes them think twice about dragging a child back to someone who sold her." The twins had retreated to their corner with Benjamin, building an elaborate fortress out of cushions and blankets. But Clara could see Moses watching the adults through the window, his young face serious with understanding beyond his years. Levi whispered something to him, and Moses nodded grimly. 10 minutes passed before footsteps returned to the stairs. When the door opened, only Harriet entered, carrying her basket as if nothing unusual had happened. "Well," she said, settling into a chair as if she belonged there. "That was interesting. What did you tell them?" Isaac asked immediately. "The truth, mostly. That Patrick O'Sullivan is known in certain neighborhoods as a man who gambles more than he can afford, drinks more than he should, and has been heard to say that his stepdaughter is more burden than blessing." Harriet unpacked items from her basket as she spoke: bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of what looked like honey. "I also mentioned that there are laws against selling children, and that any transaction of that nature would be null and void legally speaking." Clara felt a flicker of hope. "Did they believe you?" "They're considering their options," Harriet replied diplomatically. "Officer Brennan is an honest man, but he's also a practical one. He doesn't want to return a child to an unsafe situation, but he also doesn't want to ignore a legal guardian's rights without proper cause." "So what happens now?" Rachel asked. Harriet looked around the room, taking in the sewing machines, the orderly piles of work, the evidence of a functioning household. "Now we prepare for the possibility that they'll be back, with more questions, more pressure, and possibly a warrant that won't give us the luxury of choosing whether to cooperate." Isaac straightened his shoulders. "What do you need us to do?" "First, tell me everything about how Clara came to be here. Every detail, every witness, every piece of evidence that might support her story." Harriet pulled out a small notebook and pencil. "Then we're going to make sure that when the authorities come back, and they will come back, we're ready with documentation, witnesses, and legal arguments that they can't ignore." Clara felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time since the police had appeared at their door, she allowed herself to believe that this fight might be winnable. Not easily and not without cost, but possibly. "Why are you helping us?" she asked. "You don't even know us." Harriet paused in her note-taking and looked directly at Clara. "Child, I know what it's like to be treated as if you're not quite human, not quite worthy of the same protections and considerations as other people. I know what it's like to have your fate decided by people who see you as property rather than as a person with rights and dreams and value." She glanced around the room at the other children. "And I know what it's like to find family in unexpected places, with people who choose to care about you not because they have to, but because they recognize something valuable in who you are." Isaac cleared his throat. "Mrs. Brown, did Mrs. Shapiro ask you to come here?" Harriet smiled for the first time since arriving. "Miriam Shapiro and I have been friends for a long time. She helped me when I needed help, and now I'm returning the favor. She asked me to check on you all, to make sure you were managing all right in her absence." "Where is she?" Rachel asked eagerly. "When is she coming back?" "She's handling some business that couldn't wait and couldn't be delegated," Harriet replied carefully. Sometimes there are people who need help getting from one life to another, from one identity to another, from one kind of safety to another. It's delicate work, and it requires absolute discretion. Clara understood immediately. Miriam was helping someone escape, probably someone whose life depended on disappearing completely, starting over with new papers and a new identity. It was dangerous work, the kind that could land everyone involved in serious legal trouble if discovered. "How long will she be gone?" Isaac asked. "As long as it takes. Could be days, could be weeks." Harriet closed her notebook and stood up. "Which means you all need to be prepared to handle whatever comes next on your own, with whatever help I can provide." She moved to the window and looked down at the street. "They're gone for now, but they'll be back. Probably with more questions, possibly with a warrant, definitely with more pressure to resolve this situation quickly." Clara felt the familiar cold dread settling in her stomach, but this time it was mixed with something else. A fierce determination not to let these people who had become her family suffer because of her problems. "Maybe I should just go back," she said quietly. "If staying here puts everyone else in danger."
No.
The word came from multiple voices simultaneously. Isaac, Rachel, even the twins from their corner fortress. "Clara James," Harriet said firmly. "Running back to a bad situation doesn't solve anything. It just teaches bullies that if they make enough noise and cause enough trouble, decent people will give up and hand over whatever they want." She gathered her notebook and prepared to leave. "I'll be back tomorrow with more information about your legal options. In the meantime, keep doing what you've been doing, taking care of each other, keeping the household running, proving that you're a family in every way that matters." As Harriet reached the door, she turned back to Clara. "And child? You're not going back to Patrick O'Sullivan if I have anything to say about it. Some fights are worth having, and this is one of them." After she left, the household fell into thoughtful silence. Clara looked around at the faces of the people who had chosen to stand with her against the police, against the law, against the entire system that said she belonged to a man who had sold her for a bottle of whiskey. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Part 7. Confronting the Law. 3 days passed in tense preparation. Harriet had returned twice, each time bringing new information about Clara's legal situation and coaching the children on how to respond if the police returned with more formal demands. She had also made contact with Jacob, who had agreed to testify about the circumstances of Clara's transfer from Patty's custody, though he was understandably nervous about the potential legal consequences. The morning of the 4th day dawned gray and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that soaked through clothing and chilled the bones. Clara was at the kitchen table helping Benjamin with his breakfast when Isaac's sharp intake of breath from his position by the window made everyone freeze. "They're back," he said quietly. "And they brought more people this time." Clara moved to the window and felt her heart sink. Officer Brennan was there, along with his 2 colleagues from the previous visit, but they were accompanied by 3 additional men in official-looking dark coats. One carried a leather satchel that almost certainly contained legal documents. Another was making notes in a small book as he surveyed the building. But what made Clara's blood turn to ice was the figure standing slightly apart from the official group. Patty O'Sullivan looked exactly as she remembered him: massive frame, unsteady posture, clothes that had seen better days. But his expression was different. Instead of the usual sullen indifference, his face showed a calculating satisfaction that made Clara's skin crawl. "He looks sober," Rachel observed from behind Clara's shoulder. "That's unusual." "Someone's been coaching him," Isaac said grimly, "teaching him what to say, how to act. This isn't just about getting Clara back anymore. This is about something bigger." The knock came exactly as Clara had expected: authoritative, impatient, final. But this time Isaac didn't bother with negotiations through the closed door. He opened it immediately, straightening his shoulders and meeting Officer Brennan's eyes with steady resolve. "We have a warrant," Brennan said without preamble, handing Isaac a folded document, "for the return of Clara James to her legal guardian and for the search of these premises for evidence of child endangerment and illegal harboring of a minor." One of the men in dark coats stepped forward. "I'm Inspector Morrison from the Children's Aid Society." We've received serious allegations about the conditions in this household and the circumstances under which the girl came to be here. Clara felt the walls closing in around her, but she stepped forward to stand beside Isaac. What kind of allegations? Inspector Morrison consulted his notebook. That you're being forced to work in unsafe conditions, that you're being housed with children who aren't properly supervised, and that the adult responsible for this household has abandoned you without proper care or oversight. Those are lies, Rachel said hotly, moving to Clara's other side. Mama didn't abandon us, and Clara isn't being forced to do anything. Nevertheless, Morrison continued, we're here to investigate these claims and to ensure that all children in this household are properly cared for according to the law. Patty had been silent until now, but he chose this moment to speak up. She's my responsibility, he said, his voice carrying the practiced tone of injured righteousness. Her poor mother, God rest her soul, made me promise to look after the girl. I've been sick with worry since she disappeared. Clara stared at him in disbelief. You sold me, she said flatly, to Jacob Mueller, for a bottle of bourbon and your gambling debts. There were witnesses. Now, that's a terrible thing to say about your stepfather, Patty replied, his tone suggesting wounded feelings rather than anger. I've been looking everywhere for you, asking everyone if they'd seen you. When these good officers told me where you were, I thanked God that you were safe. The performance was so smooth, so convincing, that Clara began to understand why the authorities had taken his claims seriously. Someone had indeed been coaching him, teaching him to play the role of concerned guardian rather than drunken opportunist. Where's Mrs. Shapiro? Inspector Morrison asked Isaac. We need to speak with the adult responsible for this household. She's away on business, Isaac replied. I've been managing things in her absence. A minor cannot be legally responsible for other minors, Morrison said firmly. If Mrs. Shapiro is not available, then these children need to be placed in proper care until she returns. Clara felt panic rising in her throat. Not only was she going to be dragged back to Patty, but the other children were going to be separated and sent to institutions. Everything they had built together was about to be destroyed by people who claimed to be protecting them. Then, from the back of the group of officials, came a voice that made Clara's heart leap with desperate hope. I'm Mrs. Shapiro. Everyone turned to see Miriam climbing the stairs, her traveling coat damp with rain and her face set in an expression of controlled fury. She looked tired and older than when Clara had last seen her, but her eyes blazed with protective rage as she took in the scene. I understand there's been some confusion about the children in my care, she said, removing her coat and hanging it on a peg as if this were any normal day. Perhaps someone would like to explain why there are 6 grown men crowding into my home without invitation. Inspector Morrison stepped forward. Mrs. Shapiro, I presume? We have serious allegations about your treatment of the children in this household, particularly regarding Clara James here. Miriam looked at Clara, and for just a moment, her expression softened with relief and affection. Then she turned back to the officials, her face resuming its mask of polite steel. What allegations, specifically? That you're harboring a child who was taken from her legal guardian without permission, Officer Brennan said. That you're forcing children to work in unsafe conditions. That you abandoned minor children without proper supervision or care. Miriam listened to each charge with the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with bureaucratic nonsense. When the recitation was complete, she walked to a cabinet near the sewing machines and withdrew a leather portfolio. Gentlemen, she said, opening the portfolio and spreading papers across the kitchen table. I think you'll find these documents interesting. Clara crept closer to see what Miriam was showing them. The papers appeared to be legal documents, contracts, receipts, testimonies signed and witnessed. This, Miriam said, pointing to one document, is a sworn statement from Jacob Mueller describing the circumstances under which Clara came into his custody. As you can see, it clearly states that she was given to him by Patrick O'Sullivan in settlement of gambling debts. She moved to another paper. This is a receipt from McCarthy's Tavern, signed by the bartender, confirming that Mr. O'Sullivan traded his stepdaughter's custody for 1 bottle of bourbon and the cancellation of his outstanding tab. Patty's face was turning an alarming shade of red. "Those papers are fake," he sputtered. "I never." "And this," Miriam continued, ignoring his protests, "is a statement from 3 witnesses who were present at the transaction, all swearing that Clara was handed over willingly and that no kidnapping or coercion took place." Inspector Morrison examined the documents closely, his frown deepening with each page. "These appear to be properly notarized," he admitted reluctantly. "Because they are genuine," Miriam said firmly. "As for the allegation that I abandoned these children, I was conducting business that required my temporary absence. I left them in the care of Isaac, who has been trained to manage household operations, and I arranged for Mrs. Brown to check on them regularly." "Speaking of Mrs. Brown," came Harriet's voice from the doorway, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." She entered carrying a different basket than before, this one filled with what appeared to be more legal documents. "I brought those additional testimonies you requested, Miriam, from the neighbors, the suppliers, and the customers who can attest to the character of this household and the treatment of the children." Clara watched as the balance of power in the room shifted. What had started as an official investigation with a predetermined outcome was becoming a legal battle with evidence and documentation on both sides. But Patty wasn't finished. "You can fake all the papers you want," he said desperately. "She's still my stepdaughter, and she belongs with me. The law says that guardians have a duty to protect and provide for the children in their care," Miriam interrupted coldly. "It does not give them the right to sell those children to settle debts. In fact, such actions constitute abandonment of parental responsibilities and grounds for termination of guardianship." Inspector Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Mrs. Shapiro, even if these allegations against Mr. O'Sullivan are true, that doesn't automatically give you legal custody of the child." "No," Miriam agreed. "But it does mean that returning her to someone who has already demonstrated his willingness to treat her as property would constitute endangering a minor, which I believe is exactly what your organization is supposed to prevent." The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and the subtle scratching of Inspector Morrison's pencil as he made notes. Clara realized that her fate was being decided not by what was right or fair, but by a complex calculation of legal precedent, official liability, and bureaucratic convenience. Finally, Officer Brennan cleared his throat. "This is more complicated than we were led to believe," he said. "We're going to need time to review all this documentation and consult with our superiors about how to proceed." "Of course," Miriam said graciously. "Take all the time you need. Clara will remain here, safe and cared for, while you make your decision." As the officials filed out, muttering among themselves and shooting uncertain glances back at the household, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced in months: the solid ground of institutional protection beneath her feet. For the first time since this ordeal began, the law was considering the possibility that she might have rights, that her safety and well-being might matter as much as Patty's legal claims. When the door closed behind them, Miriam turned to Clara and opened her arms. Clara ran into that embrace with a sob of relief, finally allowing herself to believe that she might truly be safe, truly home, truly protected by people who saw her as more than just property to be bought and sold. Part 8: Trouble Never Leaves. The victory felt hollow within a week. Miriam had returned with legal documentation that temporarily protected Clara from being forced back to Patty, but the household quickly discovered that bureaucratic harassment was only the beginning of their problems. The real troubles started small and grew progressively worse, like an infection spreading through the fabric of their daily lives. First, the water began tasting strange. Not bad enough to be undrinkable, but with a metallic tang that made everyone wrinkle their noses. Miriam suspected tampering with the building's water supply, but proving it would require expensive testing they couldn't afford. They began buying water from the vendor down the street, adding yet another cost to their already tight budget. Then the roof started leaking. Not gradually, as old roofs typically do, but suddenly and catastrophically during the first heavy rain after the official's visit. Water poured through multiple points in the ceiling, soaking fabric inventory, damaging sewing machines, and forcing everyone to work around buckets and makeshift coverings. "This isn't natural wear," Isaac observed, examining the damage in the gray morning light after the storm. Someone's been up there, loosening shingles, pulling away the waterproofing. Clara stood beside him on the narrow fire escape, looking at the obvious signs of sabotage. Shingle nails had been pulled partially out, leaving gaps for water to enter. Sections of the roof's protective coating had been scraped away in deliberate patterns. "Who would do this?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Someone who wants us gone," Isaac replied grimly. "Someone who figures if they make life difficult enough, will give up and move away." The harassment escalated over the following days. Their regular suppliers began refusing deliveries, claiming credit problems that Miriam knew were fabricated. Customers who had relied on their services for months suddenly canceled orders without explanation. Even the friendly baker next door became cold and distant, no longer offering day-old bread at reduced prices. Clara threw herself into repair work with desperate intensity. She learned to patch roof leaks, to reinforce weakened structures, to make their dwindling supplies stretch further. Her hands, already calloused from sewing, developed new roughness from handling tools and climbing on ladders. But it was the children who bore the heaviest burden. Benjamin began having nightmares, waking up crying for his mother in the middle of the night. The twins lost their usual playful energy, becoming quiet and clingy. Rachel tried to maintain her cheerful optimism, but Clara could see the strain in the tight lines around her eyes. Isaac aged years in a matter of days. The responsibility of helping hold the household together while dealing with increasingly aggressive creditors and suspicious neighbors pressed down on his young shoulders like a physical weight. He took to staying up late into the night, poring over their account books and trying to find ways to make their shrinking income cover their growing expenses. "We can't keep this up," he admitted to Clara one evening as they worked together to repair a sewing machine that had been mysteriously damaged. "Even if we fix everything they break, even if we find new suppliers and customers, we're hemorrhaging money. The legal fees alone are eating through our savings." Clara knew he was right, but admitting defeat felt like betraying everyone who had stood by her. "There has to be something we can do." "Maybe there is," Isaac said slowly, "but you're not going to like it." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Miriam appeared in the doorway carrying a letter that made her face look 10 years older. She sat down heavily at the kitchen table and spread the document out in front of her. "What is it?" Rachel asked, emerging from the back room where she had been trying to salvage water-damaged fabric. "Notice of eviction proceedings," Miriam said quietly. "Ray Caswell, the building owner, is claiming we've violated our lease terms. Says we're operating a business without proper permits, housing too many people in a residential space, and causing damage to the property." Clara felt ice form in her stomach. "Can he do that?" "He can try," Miriam replied. "Whether he can succeed depends on how much money he's willing to spend on lawyers and how much influence he has with local officials." Harriet, who had been visiting more frequently since the confrontation with the police, looked up from where she was helping Benjamin with his dinner. "Ray Caswell," she mused. "That name sounds familiar. Isn't he the one trying to build that new trolley line through the neighborhood?" Miriam nodded grimly. "He's been buying up properties along the proposed route, trying to clear out existing tenants so he can demolish buildings and sell the land to the city." "And suddenly our problems make sense," Isaac said bitterly. "It's not just about Clara. It's about getting rid of all of us so he can tear down the building." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Patty's sudden concern for Clara's welfare, the official investigation into their household, the systematic harassment from suppliers and neighbors. It had all been orchestrated by someone with enough money and influence to make their lives miserable until they gave up and left. "What do we do?" Rachel asked, her voice smaller than Clara had ever heard it. Miriam was quiet for a long moment, staring at the eviction notice as if she could make it disappear through sheer force of will. "We fight," she said finally. "We document everything, every incident of harassment, every suspicious cancellation, every act of sabotage. We find out who's paying for this campaign against us, and we expose them." "How?" Clara asked. "We don't have money for lawyers or investigators." "No," Miriam agreed, "but we have something else. We have the truth, and we have each other. And we have friends in this community who remember what it was like before men like Caswell started trying to reshape the neighborhood to suit their profit margins. Over the next 2 days, Clara watched Miriam transform from worried guardian into strategic general. She sent Isaac to gather information about Caswell's business dealings and property acquisitions. She dispatched Rachel to talk to other families who had been pressured to leave their homes. She asked Harriet to use her connections in other neighborhoods to find out if similar patterns of harassment had occurred elsewhere. Clara's role was perhaps the most crucial. She became the face of their resistance. Miriam coached her on how to tell her story, not as a victim seeking pity, but as a young person demanding justice and protection for her chosen family. People respond to courage more than they respond to suffering, Miriam explained as they prepared for what would become their most important battle yet. Show them that you're fighting not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been treated as if their lives don't matter. The plan was ambitious and risky. Instead of quietly accepting their fate or trying to negotiate with Caswell's representatives, they were going to take their case directly to the public. Clara would tell her story to anyone willing to listen: church groups, neighborhood associations, and most importantly, newspaper reporters who might be interested in a story about corruption and child welfare. "Are you ready for this?" Miriam asked Clara the night before they were scheduled to visit the offices of the New York Times. "Once we start this fight, there's no going back. Caswell and his people will try to destroy us completely." Clara looked around the room at the faces of her chosen family: Isaac with his premature seriousness, Rachel with her determined optimism, the twins with their unshakable bond, little Benjamin with his trusting eyes, and Miriam with her fierce, protective love. "I'm ready," she said. "I won't let them tear apart our family." But as she lay in bed that night, listening to the sound of rain through the still leaking roof and the distant rumble of the elevated train that carried people to lives she could barely imagine, Clara wondered if courage and determination would be enough to stand against money and influence and the casual cruelty of people who saw children as obstacles to be removed rather than human beings to be protected. Tomorrow would bring their biggest test yet. Tomorrow, they would discover whether truth really was more powerful than lies, whether justice really existed for people like them, whether a family built from love and necessity could survive against forces determined to destroy them. Clara closed her eyes and whispered a prayer her mother had taught her years ago. "Give me strength not just to endure, but to fight. And if I must fall, let me fall forward, toward something better." Outside, the rain continued to fall through the damaged roof, but inside, the sound of 6 people breathing in peaceful sleep proved that some things, family, love, determination, remained unbroken despite everything that had been thrown against them. Part 9: Public Challenge. The offices of the New York Times occupied an imposing brick building that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who dared to challenge the established order. Clara stood on the sidewalk outside, clutching a worn leather satchel containing all their carefully gathered evidence, and tried to summon the courage that had brought her this far. Miriam placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Remember, you're not asking for charity. You're demanding justice. There's a difference, and it shows in how you carry yourself." The lobby was a maze of bustling reporters, clicking typewriters, and men in shirt sleeves shouting across the room about deadlines and breaking stories. Clara had never seen so much organized chaos, so much energy directed toward the single purpose of telling stories to the world. A young man with ink-stained fingers and tired eyes looked up from his desk when Miriam approached. "Can I help you, ladies? I'm looking for someone who might be interested in a story about corruption, child welfare, and business interests trying to silence inconvenient families," Miriam said with the confidence of someone who knew her story was worth telling. The reporter's expression sharpened. "What kind of corruption?" "The kind where a wealthy developer uses intimidation, bribery, and legal harassment to force families out of their homes so he can demolish their neighborhood for profit," Clara said, stepping forward before her nerves could betray her. The young man, his nameplate read Thomas Mitchell, gestured to 2 chairs beside his desk. "Sit down and tell me everything." Clara had practiced the story dozens of times, but telling it to a real reporter who was taking real notes felt different. Every word mattered. Every detail could be the difference between justice and continued persecution. She started with Patty selling her for a bottle of bourbon, but quickly moved to the larger pattern: how families throughout the neighborhood were being pressured to leave, how city officials were being influenced to look the other way while children suffered, how Ray Caswell's development plans depended on clearing out the people who had built their lives in these streets. Mitchell's pencil moved steadily across his notepad. Occasionally, he stopped to ask clarifying questions or to request documentation for specific claims. Clara watched his face change as the scope of the story became clear. This wasn't just about one displaced child, but about systematic abuse of power affecting dozens of families. "You understand the seriousness of these accusations?" Mitchell asked when Clara finished her account. "You're alleging that a prominent businessman has engaged in criminal conspiracy to defraud tenants of their legal rights. I'm alleging that a prominent businessman has forgotten that the people he's trying to displace are human beings with rights and dignity," Clara replied. "Whether that's criminal is for others to decide. But it's certainly wrong." Mitchell spent the next hour reviewing their documentation: the witness statements about Patty's transaction, the evidence of systematic harassment, the financial records showing how families were being pressured through artificial hardship. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who had found exactly the kind of story he lived to tell. "Miss James, if even half of what you've documented here is accurate, this is going to be front-page news. But you need to understand something. Once this story runs, Ray Caswell and his associates are going to come after you with everything they have. Are you prepared for that?" Clara looked at Miriam, who nodded encouragingly. "Mr. Mitchell, they're already coming after us with everything they have. At least this way, people will know why." The story ran 3 days later under the headline "Brooklyn Widow Fights Developer for Children's Right to Home." Mitchell had done his research thoroughly, uncovering not just Clara's situation but a pattern of similar harassment affecting families throughout the proposed trolley route. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters poured into the Times offices from readers expressing outrage at Caswell's tactics. Church groups organized collection drives to help affected families with legal fees. Labor organizers saw parallels to their own fights against business interests that treated workers as disposable resources. But it was the response from other families that moved Clara most deeply. Dozens of people came forward with their own stories of harassment, intimidation, and pressure to abandon homes they had built over decades. What had seemed like isolated incidents revealed themselves as part of a coordinated campaign that affected hundreds of people. Mrs. Kowalski from the bakery next door appeared at their door the morning after the story ran, carrying a basket of fresh bread and wearing an expression of profound shame. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "They told me that if I kept doing business with you, they'd find ways to shut down my shop. I was scared." "We understand," Miriam replied, accepting the bread and the apology with equal grace. "Fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. What matters is what we do when we're not afraid anymore." The neighborhood began to change almost overnight. Suppliers who had mysteriously canceled their services suddenly discovered that their credit concerns had been resolved. Customers who had stopped placing orders returned with apologetic explanations about misunderstandings and pressure from unnamed sources. Most significantly, other families facing similar harassment began organizing themselves into a collective resistance. If Caswell wanted to clear the neighborhood, he would have to fight not just individual families but an entire community that had learned to see through his tactics. Clara found herself at the center of this growing movement, not because she had sought leadership but because her story had become a symbol of something larger. She spoke at neighborhood meetings, helped other families document their experiences, and worked with Mitchell to investigate additional instances of corruption. The work was exhausting but exhilarating. For the first time in her life, Clara felt like her voice mattered, like her experiences could help protect other people from suffering similar injustices. The child who had been sold for a bottle of whiskey had become a young woman fighting for the rights of families throughout Brooklyn. But Caswell was not defeated yet. 3 weeks after the Times story ran, Clara woke to find Isaac standing by the kitchen window with a grim expression that immediately put her on alert. "What is it?" she asked. "Look at this." Isaac handed her a legal document that had been slipped under their door during the night. "It's not an eviction notice this time." Clara read the paper with growing disbelief. It was a lawsuit not against Miriam or the household, but against Clara personally. Ray Caswell was suing her for defamation, claiming that her statements to the newspaper had damaged his reputation and cost him significant business opportunities. Can he do this? Clara asked, though she already knew the answer. Rich men could do almost anything to poor children, especially when they had lawyers and influence on their side. He can try, Miriam said, reading over Clara's shoulder. But this might be the mistake we've been waiting for him to make. What do you mean? Miriam smiled with the expression of someone who had just seen her opponent overplay his hand. He's suing a child for telling the truth about her own experiences. Do you know how that's going to look in the newspapers? Do you know how many people are going to rally to support a girl who's being legally attacked for refusing to stay silent about injustice? That afternoon, Clara returned to the Times offices, but this time she wasn't alone. Mitchell had called ahead, and when she arrived, she found herself facing not just one reporter but 5, along with a photographer who wanted to capture the image of a young woman standing up to corporate intimidation. Mr. Caswell has made this personal, Clara told the assembled journalists. He's trying to silence me because my story threatens his profits. But I won't be silenced. If he wants to fight me in court, then let's fight. Let's make sure everyone can see exactly what kind of man thinks it's acceptable to sue a child for telling the truth. The story that ran the next day was even more prominent than the first. This time, the headline read, "Developer Sues Child Witness. Clara James faces legal attack for speaking truth about housing corruption." The public response was swift and furious. Legal aid societies offered to represent Clara free of charge. Civil rights organizations denounced Caswell's tactics as an abuse of the legal system. Editorial writers across the city condemned the lawsuit as an attempt to intimidate witnesses and silence legitimate criticism. Most importantly, city officials who had previously ignored complaints about Caswell's development practices suddenly found themselves under intense public scrutiny. The trolley line project, which had been moving forward with minimal oversight, was subjected to new reviews and public hearings. Clara realized that she had stumbled upon something more powerful than individual resistance. She had discovered how to use public attention and moral outrage as weapons against injustice. The girl who had once been powerless had learned to turn her voice into a force that could challenge even wealthy, influential men. But as she prepared for what would surely be a long legal battle, Clara understood that the real victory wasn't in defeating Ray Caswell. The real victory was in proving that families like hers, improvised, unconventional, built from necessity rather than blood, deserved the same protection and respect as any other family. They had started as strangers brought together by circumstances beyond their control. Now they were something more. They were proof that love and determination could create bonds stronger than legal documents, that children could become advocates for justice, and that the truth, when spoken loudly enough and persistently enough, could indeed set people free. Part 10. New Roots. 6 months after the lawsuit was filed, Clara stood in the same courtroom where her fate had once hung in the balance. But this time she was not the frightened child being traded between adults. She was a young woman who had learned to speak for herself and for others who had no voice. The legal battle had been long and exhausting, but it had also been transformative. Ray Caswell's lawsuit against Clara had backfired spectacularly, drawing national attention to housing corruption and corporate intimidation tactics. What he had intended as a simple way to silence an inconvenient witness had become a cause célèbre that united communities across New York City. Judge Margaret Rothschild, one of the few women on the bench in New York, had presided over the case with a combination of legal rigor and human compassion that gave Clara hope for justice. When she rendered her final verdict, dismissing Caswell's lawsuit with prejudice and ordering him to pay all legal costs, her words resonated far beyond the courtroom. This court finds that Mr. Caswell's lawsuit was not merely frivolous, but constituted a malicious attempt to use the legal system to silence legitimate criticism and intimidate witnesses, Judge Rothschild declared. Miss James had every right to speak truthfully about her experiences, and Mr. Caswell's attempt to punish her for doing so represents an abuse of legal process that this court will not tolerate. But the real victory came in the weeks that followed. The City Council, responding to public pressure and extensive media coverage, voted to suspend the trolley development project pending a full investigation into Caswell's business practices. The investigation, conducted by a special committee with broad subpoena powers, uncovered a pattern of bribery, intimidation, and fraud that resulted in criminal charges against Caswell and several city officials. More importantly for Clara and her family, the Shapiro household was officially recognized by the city as a legitimate foster care placement. Miriam received formal certification as a foster parent, and Clara's legal status was permanently transferred from Patty's custody to Miriam's guardianship. The ceremony took place in the same courthouse where Clara had once faced the possibility of being dragged back to a man who had sold her for whiskey. This time, she stood beside Miriam while Judge Rothschild signed the papers that made their chosen family legally official. "Clara James," the judge said, looking directly at her. "You have shown remarkable courage in fighting not just for yourself, but for justice more broadly. I hope you understand that what you've accomplished here will protect other children for years to come." As they left the courthouse, Clara realized that the scared, angry child who had been sold like trash had been transformed into someone she barely recognized. She had learned to use her voice as a weapon against injustice, to turn her pain into purpose, to build family from friendship and determination rather than blood and legal obligation. The household itself had also been transformed. What had once been a precarious arrangement of necessity had become a model for alternative family structures. Social workers from across the city visited to study Miriam's methods, and several other families in the neighborhood had adopted similar approaches to caring for displaced children. Isaac had grown into the role of household manager with remarkable skill, handling business operations that would challenge many adults. Rachel had discovered a talent for teaching, working with younger children in the neighborhood to help them develop reading and sewing skills. The twins had channeled their natural creativity into designing more efficient workflows for their sewing operation, increasing productivity while reducing physical strain on the workers. Even little Benjamin, now speaking in full sentences and displaying an unexpected aptitude for numbers, had found his place in the family enterprise. He helped with simple sorting tasks and served as the household's unofficial greeter, charming customers with his serious expressions and careful politeness. But perhaps the most significant change was in Clara herself. The girl who had once been defined by what had been done to her had become someone who defined herself by what she chose to do for others. She spent her mornings working in the sewing operation, her afternoons tutoring neighborhood children, and her evenings helping other families navigate the legal and bureaucratic challenges of protecting their homes and children. On a warm spring morning, exactly 1 year after Patty had sold her to Jacob, Clara stood on the same fire escape where she had once examined evidence of sabotage to their roof. But now she was looking at something entirely different. A small garden that Isaac had helped her plant in containers along the building's rooftop. The tomatoes were beginning to ripen, the herbs were flourishing in the morning sun, and the flowers she had planted in memory of her mother were blooming in shades of blue and white that reminded her of her mother's eyes and smile. "It's beautiful," Rachel said, joining her on the fire escape with a cup of coffee and a satisfied smile. "Mama says you have a gift for making things grow." Clara accepted the coffee gratefully and looked out over the neighborhood that had become her home. The streets below were busy with the morning commerce of a community that had learned to protect itself. The bakery next door was thriving, Mrs. Kowalski having discovered that supporting her neighbors was actually better for business than trying to appease distant corporate interests. "I had good teachers," Clara replied, thinking not just of Miriam but of everyone who had shown her that family was something you built rather than something you were born into. As she stood there watching the neighborhood come alive with purposeful activity, Clara heard footsteps on the stairs below. She looked down to see a young man climbing toward their floor, carrying a battered suitcase and wearing the expression of someone who had traveled far to arrive at an uncertain destination. When he reached their landing, he looked up at Clara with eyes that were startlingly familiar, the same green eyes she saw in her own reflection, the same stubborn set to the jaw that her mother had always said Clara had inherited from her father's side of the family. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't immediately place. "I'm looking for Clara James. I was told she might be living here." Clara's heart stopped. She gripped the fire escape railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Who's asking?" "My name is Daniel," he said, setting down his suitcase and removing his cap. "Daniel James. I think I might be your brother." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Daniel, her brother Daniel, who she had believed dead for over 2 years, who had disappeared when their mother became too sick to care for both children, who she had mourned as another casualty of poverty and neglect. "Daniel?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. He smiled then, and it was their mother's smile, bright and hopeful despite everything life had thrown at him. "Hello, Clara. I've been looking for you for a very long time." Clara ran down the fire escape steps, not caring about safety or dignity, and threw herself into her brother's arms. They stood there on the landing, holding each other and crying, while Rachel called for Miriam and the household began to reorganize itself around the miracle of family reuniting against all odds. Later, as Daniel told the story of his search years of working his way through orphanages and foster homes, following leads and rumors, never giving up hope that he would find his sister, Clara realized that her story was not ending but beginning. She had been sold like trash, but she had learned to see herself as treasure. She had been abandoned by those who should have protected her, but she had found protection with people who chose to love her. She had lost the family she was born into, but she had built a family that would last forever. As evening fell and the household gathered around the dinner table, Miriam at the head, Isaac managing the practical details, Rachel entertaining everyone with stories from her day, the twins whispering their secrets, Benjamin solemnly distributing bread to everyone, Daniel marveling at the organized chaos of their routine, and Clara herself finally, truly home. She understood that some stories don't end with happiness. They end with possibility, with the knowledge that no matter how badly people treat you, you can choose to treat others better. With the understanding that family is not defined by blood or law, but by the decision to care for each other when caring is the hardest thing to do. Clara James had been sold for a bottle of whiskey, but she had learned that her true value could never be bought or sold. It could only be recognized, cherished, and shared with others who understood that every person, no matter how young, how poor, how powerless they might seem, carries within themselves the capacity to change the world. The sewing machines hummed their familiar song. The gas lamps cast their warm light on faces filled with love and determination, and somewhere in Brooklyn, a family that had been built from scraps and necessity proved that the most beautiful things in life are often the ones that grow in the most unlikely places.